It was one of those calm, sun-drenched mornings where nothing seemed out of place. The kind where birds chirped lazily, and the neighborhood's sprinklers clicked on in unison like a well. I'm suburban ballet. My wife and I had only recently moved into the neighborhood, a quiet, upscale community nestled at the edge of the hills. Wide sidewalks, manicured lawns, and perfectly spaced maple trees gave the place a postcard feel. But even on the calmest street, trouble can lurk behind a curtain or, in our case, behind a pearl-white picket fence. Our home sat at the corner of the cul-de-sac, and I always parked my black Jeep Wrangler, a rugged, custom-built beast of a vehicle, just beside our garage. It wasn't just any Jeep. It had been with me for years, through 3 states, 2 deployments, and more off-road adventures than I could count. It had a matte, black wrap, lifted suspension, military, grade tires, and a faint decal on the rear bumper that hinted at my background. It wasn't flashy, but it was unmistakable, and it carried a silent story in every scratch and dent on its frame. I first noticed her on the second day we moved in. Karen, mid-50s, frosted, blonde bob, bright yoga pants, and a scowl so permanent it may as well have been tattooed. She stood on her lawn, watering plants that didn't need watering, glaring at my Jeep like it had run over her begonias. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she didn't like Jeeps. Maybe she had a thing against military-looking vehicles. Or maybe, like most people in every HOA horror story you've ever heard, she simply couldn't function unless every driveway looked exactly like the others. The first incident was small. I came out one morning to find a folded note placed under my windshield wiper. It read in a tight, looping cursive, asterisk, "This vehicle is not in compliance with community aesthetics. Please park inside or conceal it from public view." Asterisk, no name. No signature. Just the smug energy of someone who thought the HOA had given them a badge and a right to police driveways. I chuckled. My wife did not. "This is how it starts," she warned, already annoyed. "You give these people an inch, and they'll take your front yard." I decided to ignore it. After all, the HOA guidelines clearly allowed for driveway parking. My vehicle was registered, insured, and inspected. It wasn't leaking fluids, didn't block the sidewalk, and frankly, had more integrity than half the rusting lawn ornaments some of the other houses had on display. But Karen wasn't done. The next week, I noticed her circling the Jeep while pretending to walk her yappy little white dog, a fluff ball that barked at everything from shadows to falling leaves. She'd glance around, pull out her phone, and take pictures, always from a distance, always with the dramatic flair of someone uncovering a criminal conspiracy. Once, I caught her crouched next to the front grille, peering at the license plate like it was evidence in a crime scene. That's when the HOA letters began arriving. The first one was phrased politely enough. "Concerned residents have reported a non-compliant vehicle." The second was more aggressive, citing vague code sections and threatening fines. By the third letter, they were demanding that the Jeep be removed from public view or stored in a closed garage. I sent them documentation, registration, photos proving compliance, a copy of the rulebook with highlighted sections, and attached a polite but firm note letting them know I had no plans to move my Jeep. I mentioned that I was a federal officer and that the vehicle was part of an ongoing professional assignment. I didn't get a response. Karen did, though, or rather, she responded in her own way. One evening, I returned from a grocery run to find her standing in front of the Jeep with another neighbor, whispering. I caught just enough to hear words like eyesore, security risk, and probably unregistered. I parked, smiled, and waved. She smiled back, but her eyes didn't. A week later, things escalated. I walked outside to find a neon orange violation sticker slapped on my windshield, the kind that's hard to peel off without leaving residue. That was the day I installed motion sensor cameras on the front of the house. That same night, I caught Karen walking by slowly, pausing to stare up at the new cameras with a mix of confusion and irritation. Still, I held back. I hadn't called the HOA, hadn't spoken to her directly, hadn't raised my voice. But something told me she wasn't going to let this go. Something about the way she lingered when I stepped outside, or the way she kept glancing over at my Jeep like it had personally offended her sense of order. My wife started calling her Sergeant Cy. I just kept checking the camera footage. Looking back, the warning signs were there all along: the obsession, the false violation claims, the staged photos. But I wasn't prepared for what she did next. What began as judgmental glances and HOA letters was about to explode into something much more serious. And she had no idea just who she was messing with. The morning after the neon orange sticker incident, I found a carefully folded note wedged into the driver's side door of my Jeep. It was written on HOA letterhead, but this time it wasn't typed. It was handwritten, and unmistakably in the same looping cursive I'd seen before. You have been repeatedly informed that your vehicle violates neighborhood code. If not moved, further action will be taken. This is your final notice. No name. No signature. Just an empty threat dressed up in neighborhood authority. I knew exactly who wrote it. Karen had ramped up her campaign into something personal now. It wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about control. She didn't like that I hadn't bowed to her, that I hadn't explained myself, that I had chosen to ignore her warning signs, her notes, her glares, her staged photos. And above all, she didn't like that she still didn't know who I was. My wife was livid. She wanted to march over to Karen's perfectly trimmed lawn and say a few things that would echo through the cul-de-sac. But I told her to wait, because Karen was digging her own grave, and the deeper she went, the better it would be when the truth finally came crashing down. Still, the harassment didn't stop. Every few days I found new notes, some printed, some scrawled in pen. One morning, there was a flyer taped to our front door, a photocopy of an outdated HOA rulebook section, underlined with red ink. No commercial or military-style vehicles allowed on driveways. The problem was that version of the rulebook was at least 5 years old, and the new version, updated after a community vote, had removed that clause entirely. It was a sloppy move. Karen had exposed her hand. She was either lying or simply too arrogant to think anyone would check. Either way, I now had more than enough documentation to push back. I scanned the flyer, saved the footage from the camera that showed her posting it, and started building a file, just in case. But the truly bizarre part began when Karen started involving the neighbors. She went door to door, starting with the couple across the street. I saw her speaking animatedly on their porch, pointing over her shoulder at my house and miming what looked like a steering wheel. When the couple politely nodded and closed their door, Karen turned on her heel, walking away with her arms crossed like she had just delivered a public safety warning. Within a week, I noticed the shift. Some neighbors started acting differently, not hostile, but distant. Conversations ended quickly when I joined. The couple who once waved every morning now gave tight-lipped smiles. It wasn't everyone. Some neighbors clearly thought the whole thing was nonsense, but Karen had definitely cast her net. One afternoon, I overheard her outside talking to another neighbor. "Well, if it's not registered here, and it's not even being used regularly, I think we have every right to call it in," she said. He can't just park it there forever. It's probably not even his. That last line stuck with me. She didn't think it was mine. That explained the escalation. She had convinced herself, or wanted others to believe, that the Jeep had been left there, that it was some abandoned government-looking vehicle dropped off by someone who didn't belong. She probably imagined some wild scenario where I was squatting in the neighborhood, or leasing illegally, or using the driveway to store tactical gear, or whatever nonsense she'd invented. What she didn't know was that the Jeep wasn't just mine. It was federally registered to my name, under a specific government classification that wasn't public information. What she also didn't know was that I wasn't just some guy with a big vehicle. My position came with certain security considerations and more than a little legal protection. But I still hadn't told anyone, not because I was trying to hide it. I just didn't owe Karen or the HOA an explanation. I had moved here for peace. I had hoped the Jeep would go unnoticed after a while. But Karen wasn't capable of letting things go. She needed to win, even if it meant breaking rules, twisting facts, or involving people who had no idea what they were signing up for. Then, just when I thought she might calm down, she made the most absurd move yet. I got a call from the HOA president. I wanted to touch base about your vehicle, he said, clearly uncomfortable. There've been complaints. I asked him if he had actually reviewed the rulebook or my documents. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. Look, he said, Karen's been persistent. She said she has photos, and she's threatening to file a formal legal complaint unless the Jeep is moved. I laughed. Let her file it, I said. But when she does, you might want to remind her that tampering with or attempting to remove federally registered property is a very serious offense. There was another long pause. Wait, federally registered? I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. It happened on a Thursday morning. The sun was barely up, casting long amber shadows across the street, when my phone buzzed with an alert from the front security camera. Motion detected 6:12 a.m. Normally I would have ignored it at that hour, but something told me to check. And there she was, Karen, pacing back and forth near the Jeep, phone in hand, her little dog tugging on its leash in protest. She was dressed in that same matching tracksuit, the one she seemed to wear every time she was on some sort of HOA mission. She looked agitated, glancing around like she was waiting for something. A few minutes later, a rumbling truck entered the frame. A tow truck. My eyes narrowed. I watched through the live feed as the driver stepped down, clipboard in hand, and walked up to her. They talked for a minute, Karen doing most of the speaking, pointing at the Jeep like she was identifying stolen goods. The driver looked skeptical, but nodded and began backing the truck closer. My Jeep was about to be hooked. She was really doing it. I was out the door before the second axle hit the curb. I didn't even bother to put on a jacket. I marched down the driveway as Karen's eyes met mine, her smug face turning slightly pale when she saw me coming. But she straightened up fast, arms folded, trying to look authoritative, like this was part of some grand neighborhood operation. "Oh, good morning," she said with forced cheeriness, voice dripping with condescension. "We've just called a tow to have this vehicle removed. It's been in violation for too long." The tow truck driver looked between us, clearly unsure who was in the right. "You called a tow for my property," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Without permission." Karen didn't blink. "It's not legally parked. The HOA has full authority to enforce. That vehicle is registered, insured, and fully compliant with HOA policy." I cut in. "And more importantly, it's federally registered. You just ordered a tow on federal property, Karen." For a second, she froze. Just a flicker of confusion, but she recovered quickly. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "No normal person drives something like that. You're making things up to scare me." I pulled out my phone and brought up the digital copy of my vehicle registration, tapping it once to enlarge the badge in the corner. It wasn't a typical state-issued certificate. It had the unmistakable seal and notation of a restricted law enforcement registry. Her eyes flickered down, and the color visibly drained from her face. The tow driver, sensing the shift, stepped away from the vehicle. "Ma'am," he said carefully, addressing Karen, "this says federal registration. That's not something we're supposed to touch without clear authorization." Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was searching for a comeback, but found only silence. Just then, a police cruiser turned the corner. I hadn't called them yet, but apparently the tow company had flagged the request as suspicious. They were required to notify local enforcement when removing certain types of vehicles, especially ones with government tags. So when the officer stepped out and glanced at my Jeep, then at Karen, the mood shifted from tense to downright cinematic. "Morning," the officer said. "We got a report of an unauthorized tow attempt on a possibly protected vehicle." "That's correct," I replied. "This woman attempted to have my Jeep removed under false claims. I have camera footage, registration, and HOA correspondence showing that everything is in compliance." Karen, now visibly sweating, tried to talk over me. "This is a mistake," she said quickly. "I was acting on behalf of the HOA. The vehicle's been sitting there for weeks and—" The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, did you verify ownership before requesting a private tow?" "Well, I assumed." "You assumed?" His voice was sharp now. "Because this vehicle is listed under a restricted federal classification. Attempting to remove or tamper with it without proper clearance is a federal offense." Karen looked like she'd just been slapped. Her voice, once loud and commanding, now barely escaped her throat. I didn't know. That's not a valid defense," the officer said. "You're lucky the owner hasn't decided to press charges." She stared at the ground. The dog yipped. I turned to the officer, keeping my tone level. "I just want this incident on record. I'll be submitting the footage and correspondence for my agency's internal report. No action now, but if anything else happens to that Jeep or my property, I will escalate." He nodded. "Understood. We'll file it. And ma'am, I strongly suggest you consult with legal before making decisions like this again." Karen mumbled something inaudible and slowly began backing away, leash taut as the dog stumbled behind her. The tow driver apologized, quickly packed up his rig, and drove off, clearly relieved to be out of the situation. As I stood there watching Karen shuffle away like a scolded child, I felt the tension I'd carried for weeks start to lift. Not because I had embarrassed her, but because the mask had finally slipped. The neighborhood could now see what I had seen all along, that Karen wasn't about rules or order or community. She was about power. The day after the attempted tow felt different. The neighborhood had always carried a forced politeness, but now it simmered with something else: whispers behind hedges, glances from porches, the quiet hum of everyone pretending they hadn't seen what happened, but they had. And so had Karen. By noon, the incident had spread across the entire block. People might not have had the full story, but security footage has a way of finding its way to the right phones. My wife had shown it to one neighbor, a longtime resident named Mrs. Langston, and within a few hours, I was seeing familiar faces doing slow walks past our driveway, pretending to be out for a stretch, but really trying to get a glimpse of the Jeep. Karen, on the other hand, had gone radio silent. Her blinds stayed shut, and she didn't take her dog for its usual 4 p.m. patrol of the block. She had vanished, at least temporarily, into the shadows of her self-made embarrassment. But I knew her type. That quiet wasn't an apology. It was strategy. Karen wasn't the kind of person who admitted defeat. She was the kind who went silent just long enough to build a new plan. One that didn't involve tow trucks. I didn't have to wait long to be proven right. 2 days later, I received a certified letter on my doorstep. This wasn't from the HOA board directly, it was from an HOA Legal Affairs Committee, which, after some research, I found out didn't even officially exist. Inside was a formal complaint, accusing me of threatening behavior, unauthorized surveillance, and disrespecting community protocol. It was obviously Karen's handiwork, desperate, sloppy, and full of vague legal-sounding jargon. I scanned the letter and added it to the growing file on my desk, the one I had labeled HOA Saga Evidence. Then I sent a quick email to the actual HOA board with attachments. The footage, screenshots of the letter, my vehicle registration, and a brief summary of the attempted tow incident, complete with the officer's badge number and incident log. A few hours later, I got a phone call. It was the HOA president again, this time sounding exhausted. "Look," he said, "I just want to clarify, we never approved any towing. That was, apparently, Karen acting alone. We're, reviewing her position on the board." That last line hung in the air like an overdue apology. "Appreciate the clarification," I said. "But just so you're aware, if anything further escalates, I won't be handling it through HOA channels. I'll be going straight to my agency's legal department." There was a pause, then a soft, "Understood." I figured that would be the end of it, but as fate would have it, Karen wasn't quite done humiliating herself. The following Saturday, my agency required a routine visit from one of our field supervisors. It wasn't connected to the Jeep fiasco, just a standard check-in tied to my role and my federal assignment. The timing, however, couldn't have been better. Around 10 a.m., a sleek, unmarked government vehicle pulled up outside our house. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out. My supervisor, Agent Green. He was here to go over routine documentation, verify security compliance at my residence, and check in on the equipment in the Jeep. We were standing in the driveway, talking and reviewing documents on his tablet, when Karen emerged from her house like a moth drawn to the flame. She walked briskly toward us, sunglasses on, jaw tight, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said sharply, directing her attention at Agent Green as if he was a guest who had parked without a permit. "This is private property, and unless you're a resident or a pre-authorized visitor, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I didn't say a word. I just watched. Agent Green turned, his brows raised slightly, glancing at her as if he were trying to understand whether she was serious or playing a prank. "I'm with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security," he said, holding up his credentials with practiced ease. "I'm here on official business." Karen blinked. The blood drained from her face faster than I thought possible. She took a step back, mouth slightly open, trying to piece together what she had just heard. Then her eyes darted toward me. "You're with Homeland Security?" she asked, stunned. I finally spoke. "That's right, and the Jeep, it's not just registered to me, it's registered to the agency." Agent Green nodded, adding calmly, "Which means any tampering, towing, or unauthorized interference could result in federal charges under Title 18 of the U.S. Code. You're lucky that hasn't happened yet." Karen stood frozen. The clipboard she held began to tilt, her grip loosening slightly as the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she had nothing to say. No condescending remark, no thinly veiled insult, no rulebook to misquote. Just silence. "Is that all, ma'am?" Green asked politely, though his tone was clear. The conversation was over. Karen turned around without another word and walked back to her house, slower than she came. That walk of shame was better than any fine or penalty she could have received. As Agent Green and I finished our work, he chuckled quietly. "You weren't kidding about the HOA drama," he said. "I wish I was," I replied. When he left, I stood in the driveway a little longer than usual, watching the quiet street return to its usual hum. No tow trucks, no passive-aggressive notes, no clipped sarcasm from across the hedge, just peace. Karen never contacted us again. The Jeep remained parked, untouched, and the neighborhood never looked at me the same. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just relief that someone had finally put HOA Karen in her place. Either way, I didn't mind, because some battles you don't fight with words,